Hello! Welcome to the Christchurch Fox Chapel podcast. It's the fastest growing conservative, evangelical, charismatic,
Invective
podcast. The entire Fox Chapel area.
Hello, Alex.
Will there be some powerful invective today?
There will be some powerful invective.
You never hear about mild invective, do you?
No, I don't think so. Is it possible to have an invective that's mild?
No, but in the same way it's impossible to have invective that's
then powerful. Powerful is an unnecessary adverb then.
Yeah.
It's just an invective.
That's right.
Well, that's why I only said invective. I didn't say powerful invective. I just said invective because I knew that.
You were wise.
I was thinking ahead.
you were good planning. So, I think Amos is starting to warm to his theme.
Yeah, I think that you could say that.
You could say that the surrounding nations are kind of like a warm up fight. But instead of like a different boxer, he's fighting everybody, and he moves on now to some bigger targets.
Yeah. It's kind of like that, everybody's probably excited. Like he's taking down their enemies and stuff like that. And then you start he starts going against the home crowd. So
Israel has the United Kingdom of Israel is divided. It's split in two: Israel in the north, Judah in the south, two rival kingdoms, if you like, within the landmass that had been the Promised Land.
Yeah.
And Amos, this prophet, a farmer from the south, is called to be a prophet. He predominantly, we think, is speaking to the north. And so he's up there in the north. He's a southerner. And so far, he has said there's a storm brewing. There's a gathering storm.
Storm's moving in.
There's a storm brewing.
Gathering
storm. And he's spoken doom oracles on all of the surrounding enemy nations of Israel.
Yeah, and they've done terrible things, like really, really bad things, like tearing open pregnant women, killing babies,
desecrating bones,
selling people into slavery.
Don't forget the bone thing, though.
The bones, yeah, desecrating the bones of the king of Edom. They burned them to lime. I think not like Lime, but Lyme.
Or like the town in Dorset. I presume.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Must be.
Yeah.
They would name.
It makes complete sense. I'm assuming that, you were saying that that's actually, it seems somewhat trivial to us compared to the other stuff, but for them, this is like desecrating the entire nation.
Mm-hmm. It's, but just the commentator I read cited that the king at the time that, of the king of Judah at the time that Jezebel was, she was killed. She fell out the window, right? Did she fall out the window?
Yeah, she did. Yeah, in
the dogs,
Naboth's vineyard.
Yeah, and dogs licked up her remains, and the king wanted to go and give her a proper burial because
Ahab.
even though she was not Ahab, the other guy,
successor. You mean the Judean king?
I think so.
Okay, cool.
He wanted to give her a proper burial because that's just what you do. It's really, really, really bad to desecrate the bones of a king. Like, don't do that.
Nonetheless, dogs made off with her limbs and sort of chewed on them and took them into the woods.
Yeah. So the Hebrew scriptures do not pull any punches.
No, they don't, do they?
Yeah, they go for the jugular.
But if you're an Israelite and you're in the Promised Land and you've had, as you explained last week, sort of border raids and people taken off into slavery, and particularly if you're from Gilead, which seems to be ground zero for these things, then you've had raiding parties come through, kind of chevauchés like they had in France, just coming through, or like Viking hordes coming through, and your town is razed to the ground, which is a strange phrase. Over and over and over again.
Is that R-A-Z-E-D?
It's a different spelling, yeah.
Okay.
It's still a funny thing to say.
Yeah, it is a funny thing to say.
If your towns have been razed to the ground, your crops have been plundered, and your barns have been burned, and your wives and children have been taken away.
Yeah.
And that's happened over and over and over again. And you hear now that God is going to bring judgment upon these powerful forces that surround you. you are cheering with every kind of round.
Yeah, we're the good guys. They're the bad guys.
So we move on now to oracles of doom against the people of God. And it's a kind of soft start, I think, in a way. He's kind of lets them off lightly initially because Amos is from Judah and he's speaking to Israel in the north. And the first kind of character in God's sights is Judah, not Israel. So we've had this format that goes on and on and on, right? Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of X and for 4, I'll not revoke the punishment. Okay.
Says then he lists what they did.
Yeah, it is about Moab and the Ammonites and Edom and Tyre and Gaza and Damascus. So he's been saying this over and over again.
And then he says, for each one, I'm going to
do a bad thing.
Send a fire.
Yeah.
And it'll devour their strongholds or their walls.
Yeah, very formulaic.
Yeah.
For 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4. So you can imagine the crowd going, because Judah maybe has a bit of a big head. I mean, this is where Mount Zion is. It's where the temple is. It's where the king's palace is. Mm-hmm. It's claiming to have the true legitimate kind of authority to say that they are the people of God. And to some extent, they're correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, they seem to have been forfeiting that right. I think it's interesting. This is number 7 in the list. Okay,
yeah.
I don't know what that means exactly because Israel is going to be number 8. It's the 7.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
And 7 is a really important number in the Hebrew scriptures. So
it is 7. I just counted them again.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. So this is the number of completeness, the number of perfection.
Yeah.
Totality.
I also think it's interesting that like you have 6 things with human rights abuses, and the 8th thing also we're going to see a lot of human rights abuses. Mm-hmm. Judah is judged because they've rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his statutes, but their lies have led them astray after which their fathers walked. It's a totally different.
We've had womb ripping and slavery and people stealing and barn burning and bone desecration, which is a bigger deal than we can imagine,
apparently.
and now we have something which sounds, I mean, rather tame. You think about statutes; those seem to us quite boring, like statutory instruments, are sort of second-rate regulations or something. They don't sound even like very important laws.
You haven't kept what I told you to do. Like, okay, so we ate some shellfish. I get it. We're not murdering anyone, right?
Clearly, God's holding them to a higher standard, but in particular, I mean, a massively higher standard
because they know better.
They knew better.
They knew better. They've received the law. They've seen God's power. They've seen him working. He's delivered them time and time and time again, and yet they're still not walking in his ways.
When it says their lies led them astray, it's an intriguing thought. Someone's lying to them. They're lying to themselves. False prophets are lying to them. There's something about the truthfulness of God, the revealed truth of God, maybe the 10 Commandments being his statutes, the concrete or stone. Is there something about false worship that goes with lying? Is there something, has something been promised to them that was untrue?
Well,
who's the promisor?
So I think it's probably referring to idolatry. It's my guess.
Right.
But they are the lies after which their fathers walked. So they've inherited this and they're just going along with it.
So what, they think that idols are going to bless them or protect them or something? What's the big lie?
That's a good question. That it doesn't really matter, maybe?
You can get away with it. Go on, you can worship the idol and get away with it. Or God is deficient. You need the idol.
I think it's interesting that they've... this seems to indicate that they've just kind of gone along with the pattern that they inherited with their culture. So their rejection of God's law was normal. It was a pattern set for them by their predecessors.
Interestingly, Francis L. Anderson.
Oh, love that guy.
Not familiar with his work, but I'm sure it's excellent.
Yeah.
And David Knoll. I always think when two commentators have to gang up and write one commentary between them, I'm always like, yeah, okay.
Like, are you guys second-rate scholars or something?
You can't do it on your own. What's up with you? Anyway.
What would people say about our podcast?
Well, that's different. This is dialogical. This is not didactic. Different medium. Doesn't count.
Yeah, fair point.
Anyway, these two guys who ganged up together and made a commentary, whereas usually scholars do so
Phineas and Ferb
alone. Yeah, but one of them's silent, right? In Phineas and Ferb.
Oh, I'm not familiar enough with it.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah, Ferb doesn't speak.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's not going to be either of us.
So they say that this word lies is probably connected to false teaching in particular and idolatry. So I think that kind of backs up your idea.
Interesting.
And the lies have led them away from God in particular. So they've been straying from God, I think, through lies.
Astray.
Yeah, their lies have led them astray. So some false teachers have come in to Judah, that would be their fathers, all the way up to the king, and sold them a bill of goods, right? Trust in yourself, trust in this false god, trust in whatever it would be, and lose trust in God.
And this is under Uzziah, king of Judah. In the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. That's what we learned from Amos 1:1.
Right. This is the dude that dies at the beginning of Isaiah
6.
Yeah. So his famous death, isn't it? I think it's sort of a landmark death.
In the year that King Uzziah died,
yeah,
I saw the Lord. Yeah. So
your leaders have been leading you astray. What they've done is, objectively speaking, or at least on its face, might say, superficially, far more trivial than any of the things of the surrounding nations. And yet they're held to this standard, which is higher. And we might say, if we're not going to be superficial, but we're going to be a little bit deeper about these things, actually, this is more serious. It is more serious to stray from God to idols than it is to rip open wombs and burn barns and take slaves and burn bones.
I think that there's a real tendency in the church sometimes to judge non-believers by a standard of conduct that actually there's no reason why that a non-Christian worldview should have that. Oftentimes, I think a lot of the morality in the West is almost kind of like, it's like a mushroom growing out of a rotting tree trunk that's fallen over, right? Like the Christendom is the dead, rotting tree trunk, and there's plenty of nutrition in there that molds and fungus are kind of living off of.
I get it.
It's an elaborate metaphor, but...
So there's a kind of vestigial benefit to Judeo-Christian belief structures and ethics and practices that we are benefiting from today.
But eventually and gradually that's wearing away. It's rotting away.
Well,
there will be nothing left.
You might say that was the problem in the United Kingdom of Israel, right? That they believed that or in the divided kingdom of Israel, they believed that they could retain the prosperity of God without the proximity to God. That's really a distillation of their problem.
Oh, I forgot about that. I wanted to mention that in my sermon introduction last week. That was so brilliant.
It's helpful.
Maintain the prosperity without the proximity.
Well, that's it. Or people have said similar things, like a kingdom without a king.
Yeah.
They want kingdom benefits without the king.
Yeah. Yep.
The king being God. They want all the benefits of godly rule without having to deal with God.
Well, that sounds like
us.
A lot of the that sounds like our Western culture.
Nonetheless, though, if Amos is speaking to Israel in the north and he's assassinated the characters of all of their neighbors, and now he's gone for Judah, which is his own clan, currying favor with the crowd, I think this is a bit like when I mock the British. It kind of works. People like that.
I noticed they like it when I do it too.
Yeah, well, fickle. The mob is often fickle. You can't.
Yeah, they want me to turn against you.
They do.
It's
the baying crowds.
Sometimes I do
looking for blood.
Sometimes I do it just for the good laughs.
I write my retorts as you're cracking the joke.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I'm ready to go. So they're with him. It's what we call an A doctrine. It's a popular thesis. The bad guys are bad, and guess what? The pompous neighbor is bad too. Right? Cool. 7 for 7. It's going very well. And we have to assume that as good Hebrew scholars, when he says for 3 transgressions and 4, they understand these numbers are significant. It's a sign of completeness. when he's gone through a load of bad guys, and the baddest bad guy is the seventh. They're with him, and there's a load of completeness. It's a 3 or 4 or 7. It's like it's all there.
And then for 8, for 7 and for 8.
Right.
Oh, I didn't draw that connection. That's
an intriguing thing, isn't it?
For 7 bad guys and for 8.
Yes.
You're the 8th bad guy, Israel.
Yeah. You're the 8th bad guy in a list that had been complete.
Oh.
3 strikes and you're out, and you've just done a 4th strike, you said last week.
Yeah.
Right. There's only 7 things available in existence, and now for the 8th point.
Yeah.
Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. So now he's turned his sights upon them.
And the audience gets real quiet.
And a lot of the symmetry has been broken. It's a much longer passage now.
It's almost like the floodgates burst, and he says what
here we go.
He really has to say.
Whole bunch of stuff.
Sure.
All right. So interestingly, all the bad guys in the surrounding nations are criticized for their human rights violations, as you put it.
Yeah.
Judah in the south is criticized specifically for its covenant law breaking. Mm-hmm. So a higher standard for the people of God.
Yeah.
Israel, who also purport to be the people of God, albeit the northern branch, right, are given an extended rebuke. And it seems to be that we're back to the human rights violations more than the law-keeping stuff. So, in Hebrew poetry, they create patterns and disrupt patterns to draw attention to things. So we should read something into the fact that Israel is 8th. We should read something into the fact that it has the same introduction as all the other places, and yet a very different structure.
And it's long. It's going to be 10 verses, 11 verses long.
And we should read something into the fact that it at least initially, there's much more concern with their human rights violations than there is a concern with their meticulous law keeping. So he's speaking to them in one way, a bit like the pagan bad guy neighbors.
Do you think this is evidence that maybe Judah was a lot more of a just society than Israel? I guess you can't. That's an argument.
If I'm only allowed one word, then the answer is yes. I agree. I mean, if we could have a long time, Israel and Judah both have highs and lows. Yeah. Israel is mostly on the slide throughout its time. Judah is a lot more up and down.
Yes.
Right. But they both end up in more or less the same place, which is exile. Mm-hmm. And or it just takes longer in Judah. Yeah. But Judah is restored and Israel is not. So I think there's a yes and no there. Is it God's faithfulness to Judah that really is the story here as opposed to Judah's better behavior? Probably that's the case. But if you were to add up kind of atrocities, I think Israel's worse.
Yeah. But we're going by our human ideas of what bad and good are, and God is laying out here his understanding of things,
which is perfect,
which is right and true and just.
Right. So in a sense, we're delineating things that they're both under condemnation.
So you want me to just read Israel?
Let's do a chunk. Yeah, do a little chunk. Do it down to like verse 8 or whatever.
All right. For 3 transgressions and 4, I'll not revoke the punishment for Israel, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go in to the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined.
So you have what you might say is power abuses or abuse of the poor, manipulation of the poor by the rich. Mm-hmm. And you have sexual infidelity and repugnant, abominable sexual practices.
And it's a violation of the third commandment. Don't take the Lord's name in vain, because they are purporting to be followers of the God of Israel, and yet they profane his holy name with their behavior.
So it's a pretty complete violation of the commandments of God.
They're taking garments taken in pledge. I guess they're taking loans.
Yeah, I think if you were a poor person and you needed to borrow money, you would put down something as a surety, and of course you probably didn't have very much, so you might put your actual clothes down as the bond, and it's like pawning something. They pawn their jacket.
So they are they've lent money to the poor. So this is usury going on.
Yeah, at exorbitant rates. They've taken a garment as a pledge against the debt being repaid. And normally what would happen if that did take place is that the person that had given the loan would hand back the clothing at nighttime, because that would be their only shelter. So you would effectively lose your jacket for a day, but get it back at night and then give it back for the day again.
But it says they are laying themselves down beside the altar?
Yeah, so they're just making themselves comfortable in someone else's clothes while the poor person goes around cold. So you've taken someone's sleeping bag.
That's dark.
There's certain rules you don't do.
Dark.
I mean, there's a game show, actually. It was kind of like a survival game show where the rival tribes were allowed to destroy each other's bases. As well as having to survive, they could go and sabotage each other.
That's like as Lord of the Flies as it gets.
Well, and what was interesting was there were 3 gangs at one point, and this naughty gang came and took everyone's sleeping bag, and it was widely held amongst all the other contestants that that's too far.
Huh.
Even though it was not against the rules,
yeah,
it was widely held by everyone on the game show. You can't take their sleeping bag. That's the thing you don't do. Take their, flint or something, but you don't take their sleeping bag.
Wow.
And so I think this you could say is a similar thing in their culture. There's some things you don't do.
Mm-hmm.
You don't leave a man naked at night.
You don't burn the bones of the king.
Yeah, so it's across the line. So what they're treating people trivially, they're going to do what? They're going to sell needy people for the price of a pair of sandals, a pair of flip-flops.
I think this raises an interesting question about the whole enterprise of usury as well, and lending money on compound interest,
right?
And the ethics and morality of our whole. And I mean, this is essentially more or less what our entire society is built upon. So, I mean, without compound interest, how does the West even work? I'm not criticizing it. I really don't know. I wonder sometimes, like.
Well, at least they don't have fiat money, because their currencies are backed by precious metals. They sell righteous for silver. In our case, it's even more exponentially bad, because there is nothing backing our currency except for more debt.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's all artificial.
Well, I mean, what's the APR on a typical credit card? It's like 27% or something. That's a ludicrous number.
And we should look up what is the...
Have you seen like the payday loans? Those are really alarming.
Payday loan?
Yeah.
Oh, those like check into, yeah.
A payday loan would be something, for example, if you get paid weekly or something like that, and you run out of money after 6 days, you go and you just borrow for 1 day, and you pay it back the next day. But the rates of interest on payday loans are in the thousands of %. They're ginormous. So if you were to borrow $100 or something like that, $200 on a payday loan, but not be able to pay it back, after a couple of months, you owe thousands. I mean, there are interest rates there that would boggle the mind of a banana republic.
It's got to be illegal.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's usury.
I think we have something like that going on here. We have the manipulation of the poor by the rich.
Yeah.
And Timothy Keller was saying that perhaps you might say there's a bit of this might be something where people more on the left politically would cheer, would say, yeah, this is great, we're going to stick up for the poor. But then immediately turns to sexual ethics, which is something that, Timothy Keller observes is usually, a topic that's popular among the right wing.
Jonathan Haidt makes the same point in the book, The Righteous Mind.
Does he?
Purity is, conservatives tend to, generally hold purity as a high value.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Haidt!
This is refreshing to have a Jordan Peterson impersonation, I think, Ben, instead of Winston Churchill.
Yeah, I know. We've been getting a little bit flat, one-sided with this.
Yeah, we need to do more Jordan Peterson. So we have... he does seem to quite like Jonathan Haidt, though. And what I see here, then, and what I think Timothy Keller really sees, is that he goes on to talk about profaning God by, say, this father and a son going to the same girl. Yeah. So you've got a man and his son having sexual relations with the same young woman.
Which is a violation of a law that's explicitly stated.
Yes, it is.
In, I think, Leviticus. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that they are...
Leviticus 18, Deuteronomy 22. Really clear.
There it is.
You can't do that. So it's incest of a form.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the message to us there would be, okay, you might have political preferences and you're entitled to have them, and that's a great thing. And it might even be true that one set of political preferences are better morally than the other.
Mm-hmm.
That may be true. One may be closer to God's views than the other, or at least maybe more beneficial to society than the other, right? Left and right aren't necessarily equal.
Yeah.
One could be better than the other.
At any given time, they're always changing, though.
Yeah. And in any event, our proclivities politically can blind us to perhaps some of our own ethical violations.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only do this left-right thing. I mean, that's entirely a modern invention. It's like less than 250 years old. The idea of...
worse than that, it's French.
Yeah, I know. It came from the French Revolution. Worse than that, it's the French Revolution. It's like, I mean, the Bible doesn't even have that spectrum of liberal, conservative. There's just righteousness and unrighteousness. Mm-hmm. And some things that we nowadays associate with being conservative are also righteous. And some things we nowadays associate with being liberal are righteous, or vice versa.
So Israel has neglected the poor, but also slept around.
Yeah.
And you look at our culture and look at the US. I mean, we have both of these things. We have real disparity in wealth. Mm-hmm. Intriguingly, you might say actually on the left there's an increasing elitism. And that's been an interesting move left to right in the last few kind of electoral cycles. Mm-hmm. But that just goes to show how unstable politics is. And at the same time, we've had this appalling production of pornographic material, the sexualization of children, the trivial treatment of deeply unitive and procreative private things, the publication of private things, and language that's infected all of our speech, a kind of growing sense that, well, it's not that bad really. Mainstream television, very, very kind of pornographic. I think if my grandparents saw a family show today, they'd be appalled.
Well, I guess there's this idea and that what a person does with in their own private life and with their body it's their business and no one else's, as long as we don't hurt anyone. But there doesn't seem to be that dichotomy between public and private in Amos's worldview.
No,
or in God's oracle. Like it is all public before Him.
Mm. Yeah.
So
He sees it all. He judges it all. Mm-hmm. And whether you think I'm good because I only do this thing and I don't do that thing, God sees it all. And this is a nation that is really doing terrible things. It's neglecting the poor. That's a major concern of God. It is practicing sexual infidelity. That is a major concern of God, because it mirrors our sexual fidelity in a heterosexual marriage mirrors the relationship of God in His church. Mm-hmm. So there's a real profanity of our image in that kind of behavior. And then this stealing of garments, and somehow, I don't know what that means, but somehow rolling around kind of happy and drunk in some sort of weird temple or church, almost sticking a theological stamp of approval on this awful behavior.
Yeah.
In the house of their God they drink.
The licentious drinking, sexual immorality, economic injustice, and idolatrous worship are all tied together.
Evidently they are.
It's like it's the many-headed Hydra.
Oh, here it is. Yet it was I, God says, who destroyed the Amorite before them. So now it's God's recapitulating His works in providing them with a promised land, isn't He?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Whose height was like the height of cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks, tall like a cedar tree, strong like an oak tree. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. God has got this universal control over all things. Mm-hmm. And it was I who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This is such an important refrain in so many of these wandering passages.
Yeah.
You were slaves. You were destitute. You were trapped. You were effectively the person that's being abused in the paragraph before. You were the slave girl that was sold for sandals. You were, all of these things.
The oppressed become the oppressor.
Yeah. You've been there. The only reason you're not there any longer is because I rescued you, says God. Right?
This is important. Societies that are fixated upon, like, to be righteous, you have to be the victim, fail to see that the victim always becomes the victimizer unless there's some sort of intervening movement of grace.
Cycles of abuse are very real.
Yeah. At most every alcoholic father had an alcoholic father.
Yeah, most every choir has a mean old lady. There's a reason for that.
Because the choir people, yeah.
Well, church abuse is cyclical, is my point.
Oh, yeah.
So, most people can tell a story of someone in the church who was mean to them, and what happens is we tend to replicate those things. I mean, I've taken several funerals here, for example, where people have talked about the old days in the choir, and such a person was really nasty all the time. I'm like, right, well, we could stop that, couldn't we? So you can see how abuse is cyclical.
Yeah. I raised up some of your sons for prophets, he says in verse 11, and some of your young men for Nazarites. That's a specially devoted religious
lay
order.
Yeah.
Lay order.
Yeah.
And is it not indeed so, O people of Israel, declares the Lord?
So God has been faithful to them, not only in establishing them where they are, but also in providing for them a prophetic voice to keep them on the straight and narrow. It's not like they were ignorant. They had prophets. They had Nazarites. So they knew the stuff. They knew the story. They told the story all the time.
I set you up.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you made the Nazarites drink wine. So this is funny. I don't know what you made them means. But they're part of the Nazarite vow, lay people would, at least for some period of time, set themselves apart for prophetic ministry. Mm-hmm. And part of the vow was that they wouldn't drink. They got drunk. It says you made them. I don't know what that means.
You commanded the prophets, saying, "You shall not prophesy." This is a society that has turned its ears and made free. It's curtailed free speech.
Oh, I think you might be right here. The censorship.
Well, anytime that there's a kind of a censorship of real devotion to God, and there's a censorship clearly of the prophets. They don't want to hear a voice. They do not want truth.
So the prophets have been silenced and the Nazarites have been made drunk. Yeah. And as a result, they don't have a prophetic voice in their midst anymore. They've silenced it. And, in a sense, we're seeing that in the West right now, aren't we? Particularly in countries where there isn't the constitutional protection that we have here. So UK, arrested on suspicion of thinking of praying in your head. And bishops calling the police on members of their own clergy, and people being investigated for what are called non-crime hate incidents. Piece of Orwellian gibberish, if ever you'll hear it. Yeah. A non-crime hate incident. Well, if it's a non-crime, first of all, why are the police involved?
Yeah.
And
who defines hate?
Well, it's such a subjective thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm certain that the majority of this podcast could be qualified under certain definitions as hate speech.
Well, I mean, in a sense, anything could be.
Anything could be.
Anytime,
any kind of truth claim, if it's comes into the wrong set of under the scrutiny of a censorious regime.
If you're going to censor things, you need to have a very strict test for that censorship and very defined terms, right? Mm-hmm. So, we do have legitimate censorship. I can't just publish state secrets on the internet.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I can't just describe how to nuke something.
I mean, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
That's the test, isn't it?
Yeah. But that is taken... Mm-hmm. That has taken on new legs, I think.
I think it has too.
And now anything that is kind of considered unpopular,
right,
is seen as yelling fire.
Well, so question number one, am I in a theatre?
Yeah.
That's the question. Are you sure I'm in a theatre? If I did yell fire, where did I yell it?
I've had so many conversations over the last year with people who are related to like have teenage boys specifically. Teenage boys say dumb things a lot.
I've noticed.
And and there are a lot of teenage boys that have gotten into a lot of trouble because there's this climate of fear. You know, you've had enough. You've had school shooters come in, and people who've, you know, these guys who've said things on the bus, and then 6 months later they come and shoot a school up,
making jokes about bombs in airports and things.
And so now, a kid makes a stupid mistake on a school and says something dumb on the school bus,
right?
And the next thing they know, they're expelled from school and they're being prosecuted, and their life is ruined,
and they're shocked, and there's a lack of due process. That's the other alarming thing.
Yeah,
you have authority figures interviewing kids without due process, without representation, and children having this tendency to want to please authority figures, incriminating themselves. I think what goes hand in hand with some of the censorship is the abuse of or the withdrawal of due process, which is what this whole non-crime hate incident stuff is all about. You know, we have a statute book of crimes and very specific rules about how we gather information and protect it from being tampered with, and then present it to a jury and what they do and don't hear.
Yeah,
and those protections under the law are very important. Once you start censoring things and you're removing scrutiny, well, then the powers that be can get away with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And so, okay.
When you have an austere ideology as well, that's kind of, that wants to take a culture in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. I mean, all of this is, I know it sounds like we're straying from the text, but actually we're pretty, like, this is right here.
If I were to describe to you a nation that had economic problems, that had, let's use the kind of vogue language of the Frankfurt School for a moment and say systemic abuse of the poor, and you've got sexual infidelity of the most grotesque order, treated with glee, openly. Fathers teaching sexual immorality to their kids, and on top of that, you've got the profaning of God. And on top of that, you've got forgetting what God is all about, chasing after idols, the shutting up of prophetic voices through censorship of various kinds, and now the denigration of your prophets and your pastors by just implicating them in the same practices as you're involved in. In other words, the church has been evangelized by the culture and not the other way around. And you don't want to draw parallels between that and today, then I think you're absolutely blind.
Yeah, you have to, because Amos goes there, and he's very willing to say things that are unpopular. All right, well, let's get more unpopular. So, hitherto, right, as you observed last week, when it came to the bad guys, God's punishment was proportionate, and it fell particularly on the kind of military powers. So there were not very many, there wasn't much collateral damage, and there weren't many civilian casualties, right? I was going to devour your stronghold. You know, take out your tanks and your nuclear missile silos, and I'm going to remove your submarines, and I'm going to neutralize your satellites, and I'm going to do all these things. It's the primary thing that he does.
Degrade your military kind of capabilities.
Yeah.
Israel, behold, verse 13, which is always an important word. I will press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves presses down. Who's he talking to? It doesn't sound like he's talking to the military. Now, we go on to, for sure, right? I mean, he's going to go on to say this, you know, the strong won't retain their strength, the mighty won't save their lives, those who handle a bow won't stand, that's the bowman, those swift of foot won't save themselves, those are maybe kind of like skirmishers and runners, perhaps. He who rides a horse, they're probably the charioteers, they won't save their lives. He who is stout of heart among the mighty will flee away. So the brave, the strong, the powerful, the well-equipped. Verse 13, I will press you down in your place, as a cart full of sheaves presses down. plain agricultural image that everybody would understand. When you pile up your harvest cart with, wheat or whatever, right? That stuff on the bottom is going to be under pressure.
Yeah.
It sounds to me as though he's talking to the ordinary folk, the general population at this point in verse 13.
You're all farmers. You know what it's like for a cart of sheaves to be pressed down.
So this sounds like collateral damage.
Huh. Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we can say that any kingdom person is in fact a frontline troop. When we baptize Hezekiah this weekend, we're going to say, fight valiantly as a soldier of Christ against sin, the world, and the devil in our liturgy.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea of being a Christian soldier, biblical metaphor, the armor of God, biblical metaphor. So, there are no civilians in kingdom warfare.
No.
Nonetheless, though, this is a change of tone. Because in a very real sense, God's punishment isn't simply falling upon military targets. It seems to be falling on the whole nation.
Yeah. Well, it's because the injustice being alluded to here it's not just something that a few politicians do. This is the sins are of all the people. A man and his father go into the same girl. They're all worshiping, false gods, and they've all neglected. And so the common people are complicit in the sins of the elites. I think this is the thing that maybe I failed to get at, but I've been thinking about. We are, so whatever your political opinions are, we all live in this United States, in this current economic system, and a lot of there are injustices in our system, and we are complicit in them. That's just a hairy problem that we don't really have any way to avoid. Like, I have an iPhone in my hand right here, right. And I know for a fact that Foxconn makes iPhones over in China, and that they've, instead of improving their working conditions, they have set up nets around their building to catch the people who throw themselves from the roof. So, what do we do with this? And there are so many levels to it. I'm just pointing out my own hypocrisy, but it's all over the place.
Well, it's total, is the point. The hypocrisy is total. And something that I just spotted as you were talking is that in this little section, he points out 7 problems. A 7-fold description of how pervasive these problems are. So that's interesting. That's really fascinating.
Sell the righteous for silver, and the need for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. That's 2. A man and his father go into the same girl, so my holy name is profaned. That's 3. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. That's 4. And in the house of the god they drink the wine of those who have been fined. I think that is either 5 or it's the parallel of 4. Raised up some of your sons, but you made your Nazarites drink wine, and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. 7.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Behold, I'll press you down in your place as a cart full of sheaves presses down. Is that 1? This is now the punishments. Flight shall perish. 2. Strong neck retrains stone. 3. Bow. 4. Swift of foot. 5. Horse. 6. Stout of heart. 7. Yeah, that's interesting. So there's some poetry going on here.
It is such structured. It's the most. I think the Bible has the most complex literature in the entire world. I'm meant to find with anything that functions the way that the scriptures do.
No, it's amazing. ESV Study Bible thinks the pressing down reminds those authors of roadkill. I don't know where they get it from. I looked in all the Hebrew and I can't see where they get it from.
Oh, signals the beginning of the conclusion. Israel will be flattened in the road like an animal run over by a loaded cart.
I'm not getting that.
Where are you guys getting roadkill from?
I'm not getting it from the text, but I love it. I mean,
I'll take a roadkill image.
I think it's funny, but I'm not really seeing it from the text. But I am imagining this idea of being kind of squished by your own harvest. Is that poetic justice kind of an idea?
There's an idea of being stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we've got these nations around. There's total judgment on all the nations.
Mm-hmm.
You hear then that there's judgment on Judah, and that provides some degree of relief for you because you're feeling a little bit like the second-rate country, perhaps. Perhaps. And so this other group who claim to be really the superior Jews, they're in the sights and they're dumped in the same basket as Moab, for example, and all the others. Right. So that's fascinating. But he breaks the poetry and symbolism a little bit with Judah. The fire stuff seems to have disappeared, and he seems to be really picky about laws as opposed to these gross, indecent behaviors. So, okay, that's weird, but it's 7 things. And then suddenly he turns his sights to you and Israel. That's the 8th thing in a complete list of 7.
Yeah.
It's item 8 on a list of 7 things.
Yeah.
That's, okay, much longer than all of the others.
In fact, including 7 offenses.
And it includes 7 offenses.
And 7 parts of punishment.
And 7 punishments. So
yeah,
3, 4, 7, 7, 7. It's 8. It's really, really, really interesting poetry that must be getting them. The fact that some farmer, fig dude, sheep man came up with this stuff just speaks to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And it's total. And it's just like our culture today.
So yesterday, Sunday, after I preached, a lot of people asked me about California. California is on fire right now around LA. There's this massive spreading wildfire.
Yes.
And
well,
I don't know what it is exactly, but
don't look at any of the video footage of young men with blowtorches roaming around in the hills because they have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, there's nothing to do with it.
Climate change wears a baseball cap and carries a blowtorch, but carry on.
Yeah, there's that too. So the question that they asked me is this the judgment of God upon California? Almost with I don't think the people who asked me this question were like gloating, but I certainly know that there is sort of like in our culture, certain news outlets have a kind of a tone of gloating. Like, look what happened to California now. Isn't California going to fall off the face of the earth? So how do we think theologically about issues like this?
So our theology really always needs to start with the person of God, right? If we're thinking systematically, and it's got to then think about human nature. So our theology must always begin with who God is and what God does, and then who are we and what do we do? And when we've gone through the systematic things, what's God like and what are we like? He's good, we're sinners. We must always then go to what does God do about that? And that is the cross, right? So if our theology isn't thinking about how good God is, how bad we are, and how God has fixed this with the cross, then we're not doing Christian theology. Yeah. And so what happens on the cross, and you know this, on the cross, Jesus stands in the storm. Jesus is pressed down under sheaves, and he's set on fire, and he's blasted with wind, and he's devoured by locusts, and all of these plagues and images and horrors are happening to him.
All of the greatest amount of shame comes upon the least deserving person.
Yeah, and these are epic similes for judgment.
Yeah.
And judgment falls on Jesus in full. Mm-hmm. And his retention of that judgment is full, it's perfect, it's sufficient. He bears the full judgment fully. Mm-hmm. So he's not just bearing as much as he can bear. He's bearing everything that there is, all of it, for us. Now, not everyone is going to avail themselves of this privilege. But for those who are in Christ, who are identified in him, the judgment has been done on him. So what that means is when Christians say today, whether it's a wildfire or whether it's just getting cancer or, your dog dies, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's epic and citywide or very personalized, is God judging me? The answer's no, with a little asterisk, footnote. But the answer's no, he's not, because he's judged himself in your place already. The full weight of God's judgment. There's not some left over. The cross doesn't achieve 90% or whatever. So no, This cannot be judgment because God has been judged. However, right, there's the footnote, because I see you're ready to disagree.
Yeah, no, I'm just interested, yeah.
And the footnote, however, asterisk would be, there are consequences to human sin. The cross doesn't eradicate cause and effect.
Wait, so you're saying that God sent natural disasters as judgments upon his people before the cross, but after the cross, we can no longer look at any natural disaster as being God's judgment?
Yes, with an asterisk and a footnote. Not in some eschatological, am I going to heaven or hell thing. It's not a judgment, no.
Or it's not a punishment?
Not a punishment. Not a punishment. That might be a more accurate thing to say.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Because he punished his son fully on the cross and took the punishment away. And, you could look at something like Noah's flood and say, okay, well, that holds true, right? God will never again will I flood the earth. Well, meaning eradicate the population through judgment.
Yeah.
Because what? Because he floods Christ.
Yes.
Don't forget, in Amos, many of these natural disaster images are epic simile as opposed to literal events.
Yeah. I think that the thing I was thinking about is that when Jesus, people come to him in, I think it's Luke 13 or something like that.
Yeah.
And they ask about
sinned?
Were these greater sinners than the others that Pilate mingled their blood with their sacrifices? Mm-hmm. So these folks were murdered by the Romans. And then Jesus says, essentially, or what about those, upon whom the Tower of Siloam fell? Mm-hmm. I guess a tower fell in Siloam and crushed a bunch of people and they died. It said, were they worse sinners than the rest? And he said, no, but you need to repent or you will likewise perish.
Yeah, which is true.
So Jesus, I guess the way I see that is that Jesus does not preclude the idea that natural disasters can be pieces of God's judgment upon human wickedness, but rather, whenever we see anything like that, we should first see ourselves as being ultimately deserving of punishment. And when you hide in the cross...
Yes, when you hide in the cross.
The same event, natural disaster, can have different meanings for different people.
And this is why we've called it God in the Gathering Storm and why we've put a boat on the front cover of the bulletin. It's not that God sends the storm away, it's that he rescues you in the storm.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on here. With natural disasters in places like California, they might in some way, in a cosmic scale, testify to the judgment that's coming. But they're not in a granular scale, God specifically judging you, because he's judged his son already.
And there may be people who are followers of, I'm sure there are, who are followers of God.
Yeah.
In the middle of that wildfire, who are experiencing that as both perhaps the discipline of the Lord, teaching them to love the world less, perhaps God's calling and equipping them for mission to their neighbors.
And karma's not real. So sometimes bad things happen to good people because the world is sinful.
Yeah. This is a way more complex can of worms than I originally thought.
I think it is. I think it is complex, but we need to be really careful after the cross in rushing to kind of proclamations about, well, this thing is because of that thing.
Yeah. Pat Robertson did this in 2012. Haiti had this massive earthquake, and he said it was the judgment of God.
Well, we proclaim the gospel, we think, fairly faithfully in this church, within the constraints of being sinners who make mistakes and sometimes even choose wrong things. We try to proclaim the gospel faithfully in our church. Yeah. And the roof leaked. So is that proof that you preached badly that week? No, don't be ridiculous. The roof just leaked. Yeah. And... so I think we have to be careful. Yeah,
we live in a world that's broken. Right. And there's some things that are just like results of living in a world that's broken.
Flip it on its head. You preached this weekend, right? It was very, very cold outside and the heating worked. So we were all comfortable inside. Is that because you were a good preacher that the heating stayed on? I mean, this is paganism. So I think we have to be just a little bit careful with these things.
Yeah, I think we do have to really, really... watch. So I guess the thing that I've I told folks is to just, I always substitute this phrase when it's a little bit more complicated than I can quite grasp. Just check yourself before you wreck yourself. People should not gloat at any other group, but rather seeing the misfortune of other human beings should lead us to mercy.
But there are natural consequences that God allows to human sin.
Yeah.
And so this fire could be, this is the asterisk footnote, the fire could be the result of human sinfulness. It could be the direct result of human sinfulness. I mean, for instance, if it was started by an arsonist, then it is the direct result of human sinfulness.
Yeah.
But, even if it's just negligent policies that have exacerbated this thing or whatever, or maybe selfish policies that have favored wealthy landowners that need water to grow certain crops, and that's denied water from people further downstream or whatever who have less money, something like that. If that, as it turns out in the investigation, is a part and parcel of why this is so bad, then you could say, yeah, there's clear, direct sinfulness of the exact nature that you find here in Amos taking place.
Yeah.
Which is wealthy people connected to those in power who are gaining resources for themselves at the cost of the poor. So, yeah, at the same time as flying certain flags and doing all the rest of it. So, absolutely. It could be the direct result of sin. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's, if you like, the divine eschatological justice and punishment.
Yeah,
we need to see that Christ is in that storm. That's the other thing we need to see.
Yeah,
he's
we
in
need
there.
to see Christ is in the storm.
Yeah,
I think that's a good way to put it.
That's a great question. It's great. It's a really interesting comment.
Yeah, I just it's happening right now, and people are wondering about it, and it's had me thinking.
So it's either a no with a little footnote that says yes, or it's a yes with a little footnote that says no. And that would be the answer.
If anything, we should look. The answer is yes and no and yes, and maybe a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. Yeah. Basically, look at any kind of disaster like that, and be reminded that we deserve much worse, and yet are loved by our Heavenly Father so that we can get much better because He took upon Himself much worse.
It's interesting in Deuteronomy there were building codes. There's this whole elaborate thing about building parapets of a certain width.
Yeah.
It sounded like how to construct a scaffolding around a construction project in such a way that it was safe.
Yes.
And so God does take actually quite meticulous interest in all sorts of detailed things. Maybe that tower in Siloam wouldn't have collapsed if they'd followed the Deuteronomical building code. And so, again, that's complex, right? There's blessings that come from obedience. There are curses that come from disobedience.
Building a society poorly can lead to a lot of disaster.
Yes.
Operating it poorly can lead to a lot of pain.
Yes, it can. But God's with us in the pain, and that's perhaps the conclusion.
Yeah.
We'll find out. Is it? Yes, it is.
Oh, they can't. They snuck up on us.
Those sneaky Yetis.
Well, if there's anything that you disagree with, this has been Alex Banfield Hicks and the crew over at Ascension.
Another lousy podcast from Ascension.
Yeah.
This has been a podcast of Christ Church Fox Chapel. Thank you for listening. We're glad that you did, and thanks for stopping by.
Stay classy.